In the summer of 1586, in the waning years of the civil wars of Japan's 16th century, the head of the Jesuit order in Japan, the vice provincial Gaspar Coelho, led a party of his compatriots in a voyage across the Seto Inland Sea from Kyoto to their bases in Kyushu. The Jesuit chronicler Louis Froich made a detailed record of this voyage in reports he sent back to his superiors and in his more famous History of Japan, which is the translation you have in front of you. Among the points that Froich makes is that much of the maritime space of Japan was under the control of people he calls pirates, particularly the Inland Sea, which was Japan's major maritime trade artery in the pre-modern period. And Froich singled out one pirate as particularly powerful, Noshima Murakami Takeyoshi. And this is sort of the quote. Upon his departure from the port of Muro, the Padre Vice Provincial set sail to come and visit the island upon which resides the greatest pirate in all of Japan. He lives in a grand fortress and possesses many retainers, holdings, and ships that fly continually across the waves. His name is the Noshima Lord. He is so powerful that on these coasts, as well as the coastal regions of other kingdoms, all make him annual payments out of fear that he will destroy them. Since our fathers and brothers continuously sail by this island, we always run the risk of falling into his grasp. The Father Vice Provincial wished to see if he could negotiate with this pirate for a way that we might receive from him a safe conduct, in case any of us were caught by his pirates, such that they would neither rob us nor do any other harm. As a result, on our way to Iyo, we approached his fortress. Padre Vice Provincial ordered a Japanese brother to visit in order to ask him for his good favor and permission for us to be able to travel freely under his sigil. The Noshima Lord afforded the brother much honor and hospitality. He conveyed the brother into his fortress and said, well, wherever the fathers were favored by the Kampaku, Hideyoshi, the lord of the realm, they did not need his favor. Nevertheless, he returned to the brother and fulfilled his request, commanding that he be bestowed with a banner of silk bearing his arms and sigil in order that when they encountered a suspicious ship, they would show it to them, which was the greatest favor that he could make to the father. And Froich goes on to say, the means by which they maintain their preeminence as supreme pirates in all Japan lies in that they are a house that has endured for many years, and they have accrued a reputation as great lords and are treated and served as such. Now, Froich is well known for fabrications, for being a big liar, but decades of sailing the Seto Inland Sea between their bases in Kyushu and the capital, predominantly on Japanese ships, gave Froich and other Jesuits keen insight into the maritime world and the mechanics of piracy. So I would argue that this account vividly illustrates several elements integral to understanding the history of pirates in late medieval Japan. An exploration of the career and life of this so-called greatest of all pirates, Noshima Murakami Takeyoshi, reveals that the protection businesses, such as that depicted by Froich here, lay at the core of practices of identity performances, mercenarism, lordship, and territoriality that enabled Takeyoshi and other pirates to become dominant sea powers in the 16th century, particularly in the Seto Inland Sea region. I argue that Takeyoshi, although he was perhaps the most successful pirate, was by no means an aberration, and there were many like him. Through protection enterprises, protection businesses, protection rackets, what have you, and the reputations that they accrued through the successful completion of these and other services, Takeyoshi and other figures, other pirates, imprinted on domestic authorities as well as foreign visitors and observers the degree to which they had turned the sea into dominion. This imprinting is visible then if we take a short excursion into the terminology of piracy. Because we're all like, well, what's a pirate, right? What does he mean by pirate? The sources for 16th century East Asia teem with a multitude of terms that we can translate as pirate. Most scholarship has done little to dig into the actual usage of these terms or to consider the perspectives of the seafarers so labeled as pirate. Most simply adopt the state's perspective and assume that, without question, that the meaning of pirate is simple and transparent. However, much in the same ways that the term terrorist is bandied about in today's discourse, or pirate in popular culture, historically the terms for pirate used by Japanese, Koreans, Chinese, and Portuguese for seafarers from Japan they're all labels. They're all applied by state officials or other authorities. These labels, and they apply them to seafarers. No seafarers actually use any of these terms. to talk about themselves. Nonetheless, we shouldn't just simply throw all of these away. They're not completely uselessly subjective labels. These terms can be read as indicators of the degree to which the user of these various labels felt comfortable with or confident that his government or his agents could control or incorporate the sea and sea people. There is actually remarkable congruency among the various terms used by land-based authorities, the officials, observers of piracy, such as Takeyoshi and other inland sea seafarers in the 16th century. All of these terms blend and confuse terms for maritime criminal and service providers, especially those who engage in some sort of practices known under the heading of protection. So, for example, even in this short excerpt that you have in front of you, Freud uses three words interchangeably: corsair, pirate, and robber. Now, if you're a Mediterranean lawyer in the 16th century, these are all very distinct terms with real meanings. Of corsair, you have to have a letter of marque or reprisal, and you get special tenure, allowed to go out and attack people. Pirates don't, they're illegal, and robbers are robbers. But most people didn't pay any attention to what lawyers said, and so they just used whatever term they felt like. So terms for license predation blurred into the others. This blurry European usage resembled ways that East Asian authorities described people like Takeyoshi. The Japanese, for example, there treated pirates as a subset of the larger population of people who dealt with the sea, who they called sea people, meaning they are other. They are not normal people who live on the land. The term for pirate, kaizoku, with several variants, was used to identify both seafarers that the government sponsored, as well as seafarers who acted illegally. In contrast, Korean and Chinese officials always used the pirate derogatorily. They had an array of terms, bandit to the term Japanese pirate. This term Japanese pirate is particularly problematic or interesting in that it can be used to refer to Chinese people or Korean seafarers, Japanese people, some Japanese, all Japanese, and even cosmopolitan crews of Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Southeast Asian, Portuguese crews. And so we sort of triangulate the usage and think, well, why are they using these terms to talk about inland sea seafarers? Well, then I think we need to talk about ideas of encounter. That they use these terms to talk about the inland sea because of various encounters with various pirates. In addition, Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans also designated specific terms to identify those who provided protective escort for diplomatic and merchant ships. Like the term corsair, there is nominally a strict division between an escort, who is someone who is performing violence or threatening violence legally on behalf of a merchant or a diplomat, and pirates who are not. But in Japan, you hired the same people to do both, to attack someone without permission or to attack as an escort. And this led to unease among officials in Korea and China, as well as Japan. So in the 1430s, the Buddhist monk Mansai, a shogunal advisor, writes, "The Chinese court is horribly worried, and their people deeply anxious about the protection forces stationed as a defense against pirates." The Noshima eventually devised, Noshima and other seafarers, they're not the only seafarers in Japan to have these, think of them as dreadnoughts. They're takebune, these huge warships. But they're not just warships. These are symbols of lordship. These carry the Noshima symbols of dominion out onto the waves. They extend Noshima authority onto the seas. And they fit them out in fitting style. Chinese influence is recognizable in the fact that these ships have watertight bulkheads in the Chinese style. And to all accounts, these are fitted out in grand styles. According to one account, even in a style greater than the Ashikaga shogun. So, and in fact, the patronage of the Ouchi family won the Noshima the privilege of having Ouchi artisans live with them for a while, which they would have then tasked with helping to design these ships. And so then when Chinese observers came to the inland sea, and they found then that there were these inland sea seafarers mixing with people like Wang Zhi. Okay. So the account that you have in front of you opens with a discussion of protection, a protection business, protection racket. The protection business was really at the heart of Noshima practices of lordship in the 16th century. And these were both practices they did independently and that they were tasked by patrons to conduct. Typically what would happen was you'd have a sea lord agent atop an island, and he would look out. And if you climb the mountains in the inland sea, you can just see for miles. The line of sight is just amazing. And so they would spot approaching ships, and they would then signal the port, and the port would send out, they called them barrier ships because they were basically setting up toll barriers on the seas to intercept ships and then extort protection from these passing seafarers. And this encounter then between the provider of protection, the Noshima, and the people who are going to be forced to pay for protection then also then needs to be understood as an encounter in which seafarers can basically perform a certain identity, because what they want to do is try and convince these travelers, you really need to pay some protection money to us. And so they had a whole host of ways of doing this. But the Noshima, what they wanted to do, they portrayed themselves as sea lords, so they practiced lordship when they did this. Okay. By having the travelers pay protection money to them, the travelers then are, in the Noshima mind, accepting the authority of the Noshima to determine what goes on in the maritime space of the Noshima domain. So the sea lords interpret it as a recognition of their dominion, that their performance as a sea lord was accepted. Now, typically, after the money had been paid, the protection money had been paid, the Noshima then would either send a member of their band to travel on the ship that was paying for protection, or actually send a ship to escort that ship. But Takeyoshi is dissatisfied with this arrangement. For one, many of the protection practices that they engage in, they're also legitimized and sanctioned by authorities of either patrons, people like the Ouchi family, or the Mori family, another powerful daimyo family. And so Noshima Murakami Takeyoshi comes up with a way to legitimize his dominion independent of patrons by modifying the practice of protection. Let's skip a little bit here. Okay. And he does so by innovating what we can think of as the Japanese Jolly Roger. Jolly Roger is, right, Atlantic pirate flag. Generally, you saw the skull and crossbones on Johnny Depp's ship, and you're like, that's a pirate. We know what that is. We're going to run away real fast. This operates in a similar way, that it's a flag that is flown at the masthead of a ship. And basically, it just conveys to everyone that what's going on is this is a Noshima. This ship is under the protection of the Noshima. So how does he get this to work? First, he has to do some work to get people to understand that there is actually maritime space that can be delimited and bounded. We think about maritime space as water. You can't draw a chalk line on the water, right? How do you demarcate? How do you regulate? How do you do this with maritime space? Well, what you do is you regulate not the water, but you regulate people who travel on the water. You regulate access to the water. And in this way, you sort of determine what can and can't happen on the seas. So what Takeyoshi does is he chooses the island of Shiwaku, which is one of the most important ports in late medieval Japan, based on the records of 15th century shipping log. Based on shipping volume alone, it was the 15th busiest port in Japan out of 106 that the log records. It was a transshipment center, an entrepot, a way station where people awaited favorable winds, took lodgings, arranged charters, and bought protection money. As early as the 1550s, Takeyoshi begins to capitalize on this perception of Shiwaku as a transfer point. Right? This idea that when you get to Shiwaku, well, you're either going to wait for protection, wait for the wind. And he orders his people to militarily enforce the illegality, this idea that engaging in protection rackets, if you're not a Noshima, member of the Noshima band, is now illegal. And he orders his ship captains to fire on anyone using guns, to fire on any ships that try and extort protection beyond the west of Shiwaku. And this perception that the Noshima controlled the sea lanes west of Shiwaku became widespread. So it's not only Takeyoshi who sort of is envisioning, conceptualizing maritime space in this way, but his patrons, the warlords Mori and Otomo, even though they're fighting against each other, they both sort of recognize that, well, the space west of Shiwaku belongs to the Noshima. Even the first of the three unifiers, Oda Nobunaga, and the final Ashikaga shogun, entrust Shiwaku mariners with protection of peace envoys in the 1560s. In order, there's this idea that Shiwaku, Noshima space, and Takeyoshi capitalizes on that, and devising this new protection business, this Japanese Jolly Roger system. He effectively changes the protection business from something the Noshima extort to something that others request. So it's really labor intensive if you have to sail a ship out to intercept someone who's, all these ships who are running around the inland sea. If you don't have to send out ships to intercept them, how much easier would that be? That's his big thought. So no longer do they send out a ship or a representative to accompany travelers. They developed such a reputation for protection that the impetus for protection sprang from land-based elites and travelers who sought out the Noshima and asked for guarantees of safe passage. And this flag then is one of those guarantees of safe passage. Now, they called these flags crest pennants, monmaku, and that it has the Noshima mon, their family crest, emblazoned vividly in the middle, right? Can't miss it. And in the description from Freusch that you have in front of you, Freusch, I think, makes a couple of mentions of this system. He suggests that there was an institutionalization of the protection business when he says, right, I'll make him annual payment out of fear that he will destroy them. Now, among pirates and other institutions in Japan, it was actually pretty common to have, at the end of the year, when you're settling your accounts, you would disperse monies to buy protection. And in fact, one organization of port merchants has in one of their ledgers a payment made to gifts called Gifts for Pirates. And so I would argue that this pennant may represent his vehicle for such a system. These were woven of silk or hemp. Sources differ on this, probably both. The Noshima symbol in the middle. And for the Noshima, for Takeyoshi, this request for protection enhances the power of protection practice as a tool of lordship. While the bestowal of these pennants acknowledged the recognition of Noshima sea lordship granted by the petitions of travelers and demonstrates the reach of the Noshima dominion and their reputation. The reception, the process by which these flags are granted is like the practice where you're intercepting a ship. It's an opportunity for the Noshima to code switch, to perform lordship. So when the people who needed protection were of high status, Takeyoshi was able to host guests with civility. This was a chance to employ cognitive dissonance. People thought they were dealing with pirates, and yet in 1420, a Korean ambassador is shocked when pirates engage him in conversation, share wine with him, and invite him to come drink tea. In Freud's description, Takeyoshi affords the brother much honor and hospitality, right? This idea that he's treating this brother as a valued guest. Records of the Noshima domain are taking up elite pastimes using cultural capital. So there are records of them engaging in kickball, kemari, linked verse poetry, renga, and tea ceremony. Now, they have to be careful because these practices require them to be successful. They have to be good at it. One visitor to the Noshima base at the port of Shiwaku derided their attempts at kickball. It was unappealing and without quality, nothing but legs flying in the air, and that was not the only thing that looked bad. So you need to be careful. To those of lower or equal status, Takeyoshi interpreted the request of a flag pass as a chance to show his beneficence. He's a benevolent lord. He would dispatch written receipts that reinforced the lord-petitioner dynamic at work when one sends a request for protection. So, quote, regarding the crest pennant, we send it according to the appeal you dispatched. Although we don't know how many crest pennants the Noshima actually issued, there are 2 flags still extant and 6 other references, and they suffice to deduce the popularity of this protection system and really allow us to sort of chart the degree to which Takeyoshi expanded the dominion of the Noshima and the range of the reputation. So Matsuda, daimyo in Kyushu, ship captain, I don't really know where he's from, a band of merchants and pirates from Ki province, the Saika band, Itsukushima, shrine family, shrine official merchant family from Itsukushima, and Imazu is a port near Hakata. Kamagaseki is western end of the inland sea, and then the Jesuit. So it ranges across western Japan, across the inland sea world. These people were requesting protection. The Noshima did not go out and force these people to pay for protection. They were sending letters and messages and messengers to request protection. And all these people did not live, none of them actually lived within the domain of the Noshima, right? So these are all, so it goes without saying that in the domain he could protect his own ships. These are people from outside who are recognizing his authority, his dominion over the waves west of Shiwaku. And then, so then they're able to show, allowing us to see how far the Noshima reputation had traveled far beyond the confines of their own immediate domains and networks. All these parties considered that without the favor of the Noshima, safe passage across the inland sea was impossible. And this is the import of the account by Louis Freud, right? The date is 1586. By 1586, Hideyoshi has conquered Shikoku. He's well on his way to unifying Japan. And yet, and in fact, Takeyoshi makes mention of this. He's like, why do you need my help? You have the favor of the Kanpaku. And they're like, well, you know, he doesn't do well on the seas. He's not a water person. I don't know. So, how does this flag pass function? We can do a quick close reading. I know I'm running out of time. So the name of the recipient would be inscribed on the right. So the Monomochi of Itsukushima in Aki. Keishu Itsukushima and Monomochi. And then on the other side is the date, Tensho 9, 4th month, 20th day. And then Takeyoshi signs it at the bottom. Because much communication in 16th century Japan actually took place via messenger, and they would want the recipient to, messenger to return safely, probably this is the date at which the flag pass became active. I don't know how long these passes stayed active. Possibly, again, this idea of an annual system protection to me makes sense. So the duration is unclear, though. The condition of this flag suggests that it was flown outside the ship on a pole, perhaps from the masthead, making it clear to any approaching ship that the bearer sailed under the paid protection of the Noshima and was immune from other toll barrier, other piratical interference in the Noshima territories. Now, this character, Kami, that is the mark of the Noshima, explicitly denotes the Noshima Murakami as the source of authority, but this character is also read ue, right? Which in late medieval Japan signified the figures and institutions of the highest authority. So it may be that simply seeing that character on a ship equated the Noshima dominion, this ship with Noshima dominion control of the waves. And they augmented, heralded their sea lordship by taking advantage of the meanings attached to flags flown on ships in Japan. Seafarers flew flags on ships for really only a couple of reasons. You would fly a flag on your ship to denote who paid to have the ship fed out. So when daimyo sponsored a ship, they would carry the daimyo's flag. The only other reason that you would fly a flag on the ship would be to invoke the heavenly realm to ensure safe passage. Seafarers would fly flags carrying Hachiman Daibotatsu, Nishima Daimyoji, Amaterasu Omikami, these various deities who could ensure a safe passage. So either way, the Noshima are in good company having this flag flown on the ship to denote authority. And the whole idea of flying a flag attached to a mast actually resounds with the symbolism associated with sea tenure in Japan, in medieval Japan. Now, sea tenure we should think of again as regulating access to maritime populations and resources. And it comes out of the estate system. And the Noshima, I don't have time to get into it, but they in earlier centuries were competing for positions on estates where they would have learned about practices of sea tenure. Basically, on an estate, to administer maritime space, to lay claim to maritime space, you would plant a pole, right? You would plant a pole out to extend a dock out onto the waves, to plant fishing nets in the ocean. This was a way that estates lay claim to the seas. So, it's possible that flying the crest pennant on the masthead, on a stick, right, on a pole attached to a ship, may have represented this act of extending authority out over the waves. The identity of representing then the identity of the authority who planted the pole. Takeyoshi realized that sea tenure necessitated mobility. The sea is a medium in constant flux. You can only pin it down by sailing on top of it, showing the flag. So this crest pennant system reinforced Noshima sea tenure claims to dominion at sea by having people external to the Noshima request the privilege of carrying the Noshima mark of rulership over the waves. Last, this crest pennant system enhances the public character of the Noshima as a domainal authority by drawing on the long history of toll exemptions. And it sounds really boring, but toll exemption is known as a kasho. Basically is issued by institutions of the highest authority to travelers, to merchants, saying you don't have to pay a toll at a certain barrier. So the Ashikaga would issue them to favorite merchants and things like that. It's a common way to earn income on land and sea, and authorities could grant these immunities to those they favored or those they wanted to attract to their service. But for the Noshima, the kasho could only be issued traditionally by the emperor and then by people like shogun, right, the Ashikaga shogun. So for the Noshima to issue kasho represents a fundamental appropriation of privileges traditionally understood as the preserve of highest status land-based authorities. And yet there's a lot in the Noshima flag pass system that resembles Ashikaga toll exemption passes. They would have learned about them from their incorporation of Shiwaku, which was was under the patronage of the Hosokawa, who were part of the Ashikaga shogunate for a while. Muramachi Bakufu Kasho had a visual component, a stamped document that you would show people that, yes, I have this tax, this toll exemption. In addition, when the Noshima would send letters accompanying these flags, they would use the same document form used by the Ashikaga, these folded paper edicts, origami gechijo. It's likely that they were borrowing from Kasho practices, again, these practices associated with the institutions of highest authority. Now, needless to say, such piratical autonomous sea lord dominion does not survive the unification by Hideyoshi, but their practices of code switching, of presenting themselves as warrior lords, makes it very possible, actually easy for them to tell Hideyoshi, yeah, we're just like warrior lords. And Hideyoshi accepts this. He needs sea lords. If you look at his famous anti-piracy edict, he actually issued several, but there's only one that's in all the textbooks. The second and third clause make mention of retainers, kumi, and local lords. And these are people tasked with handling, basically, in the second clause it says, basically go out and anybody who ever touches the ocean, captains, fishermen, Hideyoshi doesn't understand the sea, so he basically tasks these former sea lords who are now retainers or local lords to go out and take care to register the entire littoral population. And then if piracy occurs, he will hold these former sea lords responsible. But they're able, through this process of code switching, to sort of finagle their way into the early modern political order as either high-ranking retainers of warlords like the Mori, or as daimyo in their own right. So I'll stop there. Thank you.